Nie chciałaś mnie widzieć.
Chciałem.
Cały jesteś mokry.
This is Criteria.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria. I am Thomas Miras, and I'm here with my co-host, James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas.
So, today we are here to discuss yet another installment of Krzysztof Kieslowski's 10-part Polish TV series inspired by the Ten Commandments, Decalogue. We're discussing Decalogue 9. And what would that be? The 9th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Yeah?
Right. Now, we've already had one commandment concerning adultery. So
I think that it's funny that, this series is inspired by each of the 10 commandments, but about half of the episodes are also about adultery in addition to whatever specific other commandment they're about.
Right.
It's
And
like
actually, in this 9th Decalogue, there isn't a whole lot of coveting of a neighbor's wife, I guess, except from this ancillary character. Neither of our main characters is coveting a neighbor's spouse.
Right. Right.
So
I guess he's coveting his own spouse, but I don't necessarily buy that. I don't really buy that that's a thing. So,
let's give a quick synopsis.
Another cringy topic.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah.
So we've done incest. We've done peeping Tomek. We've done, what other cringy topics have there been?
It's hard,
like really cringy ones.
It's hard to recall past those two that you already mentioned.
I think those are the most cringy ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess murder is cringy. That was number 5. But yes, now we are into the realm of what would be a simple if the main character weren't such a loser, it would be a simple story about adultery. Wait, no, that doesn't make sense. I guess you're a cuckold even if you're not a loser. But he definitely plays the part of the cuckold in a very kind of pathetic way.
Yeah.
So our main characters are a married couple, Romek and Hanka, and
or Roman and Hania.
Yes, Romek and Hanka being the Polish. What was the expression?
We think that they're pet names.
Pet names, yes, yeah. So Polish names, it's adding a K in there seems to be a common thing. We've noticed.
Any Polish listeners with any familiarity of this naming convention, please correct us.
Sure, or
don't hold your peace.
Affirm us. The film starts with Romek being diagnosed with impotence. It's an issue that he's been struggling with for a few years, but he's given news that he is past all hope from a medical standpoint, that he will never be able to have relations with a woman again. So he breaks the news to his wife, and I think we could just go into the details later, but basically, as it develops, she's having an affair with a younger man, and he is kind of spying on her throughout the episode, rather than really confronting her about it, just kind of spying on her and being really sad about it and hating himself.
Yeah. It's interesting because the film opens, as you mentioned, with him in Krakow visiting this friend of his who's a doctor.
Yeah.
And the first lines of dialogue are, so what do you want? This is the doctor asking him.
That's not the first line, actually.
Oh, what is it?
The film opens with Hania waking up suddenly, and we're seeing her actually in a mirror, which is interesting. So she's she says her husband's name, she notices he's not there. Yeah, so we start with her saying his name, and it establishes this kind of connection that they have throughout the film, because there's a number of points where he's like in trouble, where she like we cut to her and see her like having some kind of like awareness of that.
Right. And then it immediately cuts to him in this doctor's office, and the exchange that I was getting at. What do you want? He says, the truth. The doctor asks him, are you sure? And he says, that's why I came to you.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, it's kind of like a interesting, that exchange is kind of an interesting foil to the way he relates and communicates or doesn't communicate with his wife throughout the rest of the film. Because basically, it never is that simple again. It's never as simple as I'm coming to you for the truth. Right. You know, and I'm sure that I want to hear it, and let's talk.
Although others come to him for the truth in the film.
He's a surgeon. Yeah. And so there's this very interesting sort of parallel story that's not given a lot of time. It's a very small part of the film, but he's treating or is getting ready to operate on a young woman who's a singer, but who for whatever reason has some sort of medical issue that's inhibiting her from singing. And her mother is really pushing her to get this operation that could be dangerous, but could mean that she would be able to sing professionally. So that's kind of an interesting parallel, because here he is struggling with his impotence, his inability to, perform, and he's preparing to do an operation on a woman who doesn't really want to perform, and is not able to, but is being pushed to do so, you know?
Maybe she does, but she's not like able to like allow that wish in herself.
That's right.
Because of her circumstances.
That's right.
Which is the impression that we get as things go on. So just a couple of general things about this episode. That this episode has connections with a number of Kieslowski's other films. This story with the heart patient, the singer, ended up inspiring his later film, The Double Life of Veronique. There's a singer in that.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it. Have you?
I have. It was many years ago, but it's interesting. There is a singer, and there's the same composer in that.
So they have a fictional composer that she likes to sing his music. It's really just the series composer, Zbigniew Preissner, however you say his name. But Van den Budenmeier, which is like the fakest sounding name ever. It sounds like honestly sounds like like a Japanese anime's idea of like a Dutch person, like a German Dutch person's name or something. Yeah. But so Van den Budenmeier shows up at least in Double Life of Veronique, maybe no. He shows up in Blue.
Yeah.
He's in Blue. He
but
might also be in.
Yeah,
I think so. So they came up with this fake composer because they needed like a fake classical composer that the series composer could compose under, and I guess they stuck with that as like a conceit, maybe. So the cinematographer for this episode also did number 3, and he also did 3 Colors Red from Kieslowski's 3 Colors trilogy. And then there's a number of other things that connect to later films like Kieslowski as well that I've heard other people point out, just things that connect, like apparently 3 Colors White involves impotence, and like there's a number of I think Red, there was some other plot connection to Red maybe, but anyway, so it's kind of interesting. Apparently a lot of things that Kieslowski only makes 4 films after the Decalogue, which are the 3 Colors trilogy and Double Life of Veronique, and there seems to be connections or things that kind of like are developed from this episode, with all of them. The other thing I wanted to say about this is that you mentioned the heart patient story not being developed that much. Well, this actually was going to be the 3rd film that they made a feature-length version of. They were going to make this into a feature-length version like they did with 5 and 6, with a short film about killing and a short film about love. This was going to be a short film about betrayal or something.
This one, not about the heart patient, but about
this whole episode. Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
But they didn't have the money to make a 3rd feature-length version.
I see.
So, but that it is kind of interesting, yeah, because there's a number of things that aren't fleshed out. I mean, another thing in the episode is like there's a scene where he helps somebody pour gas into a car.
Yeah.
Which is like you hardly even see the character, but that's like one of the other people at the hospital, and he's like a whole character in the screenplay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, he's not like a major character, but he has conversations with him about the girl that kind of like flesh out what's actually going on. And I think in the screenplay she actually dies, because it's interesting. He lies he's really upset, and he lies to his wife about why he's upset, which is that because he knows suspects she's cheating on him, and he doesn't want her to know that he suspects. So he says somebody died in an operation. And in the script, I think we're told that she actually did die.
Wow.
Whereas in this, she actually lives. Yeah. And it provides a different kind of relationship for him. Right. In the story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I really think that probably of all of the films that we've watched so far on the Decalogue, this one, I think, it just seems to me like it exists so nicely as a short film that the story itself doesn't strike me as particularly remarkable. It's kind of run of the mill even. Guy suspects his wife is cheating on him, finds out that she is, and then there's like reconciliation. But it's really like in the dramatic structure of the narrative that the film excels, I think, and it's in its pacing and in the way that it frames things, the expectations that it gives you, that makes this like not only a really exciting and pleasant experience, but also, kind of evocative. Especially some of these pairings that are happening, like with that heart patient, little like a little dash of something that kind of, it's like a spice, or like some bitters in a cocktail. It's like just a little dash of something that really like changes the overall impression of the plot.
Well, yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed. I found this one more kind of like, I was like, it's more of like a nail biter maybe than some of the other ones. I don't know what you think, but it's there's so much in like the timing in this episode, like who knows what, when stuff, and like phone calls, somebody missing a phone call, somebody getting a phone call, a busy, the phone is like a very powerful, like, thing in this episode. There's a lot of shots of phones, a lot of use of phones, listening to people on phones. And so, but like the precise timing of when everything happened is pretty important for this episode. Mm-hmm. And the timing also is unclear in certain parts, which raises questions about like when something was happening or not happening. For example, so he comes home and tells her, he tells her that he is impotent, his wife, and basically, like, there's this conversation about, like, what's going to happen to their marriage as a result of this. And she starts it off by saying she loves him. Or, no. She starts it off by saying, like, do you love me? Like, I care about what we have, not what we don't have. Like, she's affirming her love for him and trying to, like, draw out that he loves her. She knows he loves her, but he's like, she says, you're afraid to say it now. It's like he thinks that because he can't like make love to her, then he can't say he loves her. Mm-hmm. And so she's saying this stuff about, I forget the exact order in which this happens, but she's saying this stuff about like, basically like love is not just like,
biological.
It's not just biological. It's not just like what's between your legs, as she puts it.
In your heart.
It's what's in your heart. And that, like, depending on how you see the sequence of events in this film, that takes on like a different meaning. Because like we don't know if she started this. We don't actually know if she's started the affair that she's having yet.
Yeah.
And so if she has already started it, then like those words take on like a rationalizing meaning, even though they're like technically true.
Yeah.
They take on the meaning of like separating love from sex, such that she can love her husband and have this affair,
Mhm.
as well as the meaning that he can still love her and be a good husband despite not being able to have sexual relations. So, and we can get to the timeline stuff in a minute, but the other thing that's established is that he says, you're still young, you might want to take a lover if you haven't already. And she says, I haven't. And then she says this thing that on first viewing is kind of a little bit cryptic, I thought, or I didn't quite know what she was getting at. It's not everything has to be spelled out.
Yeah.
And I'm okay, what does that mean?
Right.
She just said she hadn't taken a lover. So what does that mean exactly?
Mm.
Does that mean she might? She's saying she might, but we don't need to talk about it. And he says, yes, it does. And then, so this is a theme that is played out as the film goes on of secrecy and wanting to know the truth.
Yeah.
And so but the reason I could see you're not sure of my claim that we don't know whether she's having the affair yet. I mean, the thing is that we cut, right? And we could assume that it's the next day that she's meeting with this young man. But we don't actually know that.
Yeah, it's true that we're not given any markers of how much time has passed in between those cuts.
And there's a cut later where she hasn't talked to, it seemed, could have been the next day, but then we hear on the phone that she hasn't been with him for a week.
That's true. Yeah. And that's a good point. I think that
my gut is that she already is carrying on this affair, because we're told that his inability to have sex. I don't know why I have to cringe at even saying that, but it's just delicate subject matter.
Sure.
And unfortunately there is a sex scene in this.
I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a scene, but
it's not explicit, but
it's it's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. But my gut feeling is that we've been told that he has been having this problem for a while. And my gut feeling is that she has already started this affair.
Yeah, well, my gut feeling actually is that he's already suspected her of having this affair.
Well, that's why he says, if you haven't already.
Yeah, right. So the first time you watch this film, there's no real reason to doubt what she's saying. But I think that on a second viewing, especially if you're paying attention to her delivery of those lines, I think it suggests...
Yeah. I mean, because what does it mean not everything has to be spelled out? That sounds suspicious if you really think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of as the film's going by, my first viewing, or not my first because I saw it years ago, but might as well be my first because it's been so long. Yeah, I'm I don't know what that means, but you kind of move on because you're just observing the story as it goes along.
What I think is interesting is that there's a sense in which what she says is true, right? Just because you're married doesn't mean that you have to completely bare every part of your heart or everything that's going on interiorly with your spouse. In fact, sometimes, it's charitable to withhold certain struggles or difficulties or whatever, there's a reason your spouse isn't your confessor or your spiritual director or something, obviously what I don't mean is that it's okay to hide an affair from your husband, or from your wife, but it is an interesting question that is introduced by this exchange. What does she mean exactly by not everything needs to be spelled out? Yeah, it's an interesting consideration that's introduced in this back and forth between them. Not everything needs to be spelled out. Well, yeah, that's true in a sense. And then he says, yes, everything does. And that's also kind of true in a sense, So already off the bat, you're thinking about, you're pulling out.
So if you think he suspects her already, does that mean he's really saying that maybe she should have an affair? Or does it mean that he's actually just trying to draw forth from her?
I don't know. Probably, clearly he's not happy with her having an affair. So this offer is kind of disingenuous,
Yeah.
It's like he says you should take a lover. She says no, I won't. And then when she does, he gets
No, she didn't say she won't. She said she hasn't.
right.
And then she says nothing. Not everything needs to be spelled out.
Yeah,
which is like
That's a
leaves
good point.
open the possibility that she
point.
might.
Yeah.
Or that like he didn't need to say that.
Right.
So like, is it that like, is she saying that like we don't need to tell each other about that? If so, or like, if it doesn't need to be spelled out, that's like so much to say that like I don't need your permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not that he can like give permission for that, but like.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of like it's an interesting because we've keep encountering these characters, particularly in numbers 4 and 7, that Kieslowski keeps giving us these men who are like unwilling to claim their rights as like husbands or fathers.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which is really fascinating and certainly makes them seem like very relevant. You know. So. In this case, they have an exchange later where like, you know, they're kind of like, they're like the moment of truth comes that like he knows what she's been doing. She's already ended he sees her, he basically spying on her progressively more and more. But then when she's actually in the room to see them have a rendezvous, it turns out that she's breaking off the affair.
Mm-hmm.
And so she catches him in the closet and they have this kind of like reconciliation. And she says, you know, one of the things she says is that, you know, you were right. Like we do need to spell everything out. And he says, you know, I have no right to be, she's like, I didn't know how much it would hurt you. Like, and he says, you know, I have no right to be jealous. I can't make demands on you. And she's like, yes, you can.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, like, I don't know. It's a fascinating. I don't even know where to start because there's so many interesting little elements to this film. I mean, I'm kind of like, there's a number of directions we could go with this. So, like, I want to talk. We have to talk about like some of the other little bits of information about children and stuff like that.
Sure.
But I also want to talk about like who this guy is and like what we learn about his character and like his motivations, and not that those are disconnected, but like which way do you want to go? Like because I also want to talk about like how he responds to his diagnosis and like his emotional state and like what.
Well, so what's funny is that I watched this twice, right? The second time I watched it, you know, on the remastered Blu-ray available through Criterion. The first time I watched it was on an old DVD copy that I have of the Decalogue series, and the translations between those two are often different. Mm-hmm. And the exchange with the doctor at the beginning was so different in the DVD version that I actually thought that he was admitting to this doctor friend of his that he had several affairs already. During his marriage.
Okay.
So in the exchange, the doctor in the Blu-ray version, the doctor asks him, how many women have you slept with, basically? And he says, he says, you know,
8 or 9, maybe 15.
And he asks him, has that been enough? And he says, well, you know, I've been married for 10 years now. And he says, okay, so plenty or something like that, you know? So that suggests that he had some, you know, romantic dalliances in his past. He got married and he's kind of, but in the DVD one, it's not that clear. He asks, you know, well, how many times have you, you know, done this? And he says, 8 or 9 or maybe 15. But, you know, I'm married. I've been married for 10 years. So it's like, it's not clear that
interesting
that this happened before.
Yeah.
You know, it's almost as if like I've been married for 10 years, so it's been a lot of time for, you know, like.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, definitely that's in the screenplay that I read and in the Criterion translation, there's no like suggestion that this was occurring while he was married.
Yeah. Well, it's almost too bad because I when I watched it that first time, I just felt like this story was so much more compelling given that he was this like serial adulterer who now had the tables turned on him.
Interesting.
So like I had a completely different experience. What do you not know?
It's like too much. It's like too, I don't know. It's like too many things.
What are you talking about?
But I think it's
A
interesting
serial
enough.
adulterer who has his ability to adulter
Eight.
taken away from
Adulterate.
taken away from him,
Yeah.
and then is now a cuckold. That's pretty.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Well, anyway, that's not the film that we're talking about.
That was just a bad translation. Okay, so but I think it's plenty interesting that like he has, that we start with this, like, how many women have you had? Like 8 or 9, maybe 15. Okay.
It's quite a jump.
That yeah. Well, that puts, that sheds some, we can reasonably think that sheds some light on what else occurs in this film. Now, not being part of the, sleeping around scene, I don't know like if that's like an average number, like I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that's like,
dude? I mean, listen, this is
for
before
Poland
this
in,
is
like,
before
the
the time
80s?
of Tinder and whatnot.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's like
is that like a lot
Yeah, probably. I don't know.
for pagans in Poland in the 80s?
My guess is that before the era of internet dating,
that would be
and
considered like a
Tindering-
respectable number, at the very, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would suggest to me that this is not a man who has any qualms about,
premarital sex.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, interesting. So, well, the point is that, like, we get that information. We also get the information that they didn't want to have children and chose not to. And I don't want to even, like, get into that yet. But, like, it does shed light on this whole, the fact that the way that he responds to this situation being so pathetic, the way that he refuses to claim his rights as a husband being so pathetic, because it would seem that so far from men who, have sex before marriage being like these like domineering James Bond characters,
Right.
in real life, actually end up becoming husbands who are pathetic and don't exercise their proper authority and don't like protect the sanctity of like marital commitment and things like that, and they don't direct sex to its proper end of procreation. So all of these things like help to give us, like, I mean, there's more that those things can tell us that we can talk about later thematically, but they tell us something about this marriage, and they tell us something about this husband. So, like, I mean, I have a number of questions kind of about the way that he responds to this news of impotence. He's driving home. He almost deliberately drives into a like a telephone pole or something on the side of the road and swerves away. He's clearly very upset. And then there's another instance where he drives his bike into like a
canal or something.
Into a canal, but it's kind of like, it's not a very, like, it's pretty half-hearted as like any kind of suicide attempt goes.
Yeah.
And then once he thinks that she's cheated on him again after he found her out, which actually isn't the case, at the end of the movie, he actually makes like a real suicide attempt, which he survives, and the movie gets like sort of a happy ending, which we'll get to. But it's just interesting because I'm asking myself, like, okay, is he like, anybody would reasonably expect it to be like upset about this diagnosis, but like, is like suicide or even like a gesture at suicide, is that like a sane response? Like what, like, why is this guy so upset? I mean, you suggested that he already suspects she's having an affair. I think that like my impression, he's very upset about that, but my impression is that it has more to do with his relationship with his wife, like, and not just the inability to like have sex.
Right.
And,
well,
like,
because she says to him, that love is not about that it's just biological. And he says, it's that too.
It's that too.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is in that first conversation that we were discussing earlier. And so I think that he's not excluding this aspect to their marriage as being
constitutive.
Yeah,
of it.
right. Or from being an integral part of it. I think he has an intuition of this.
Yeah.
And maybe it's one that he's suppressed for most of their marriage, but now when it becomes clear, not only that he's unable to engage in this aspect of married life, but also that it very well may be that his wife is going elsewhere and taking those rights somewhere else.
I think the fact that he actually his only like really real suicide attempt comes after he thinks that he's basically lost her definitively indicates that it's more about his like grief, his upset is more about the threat to his overall marriage with her than just like not the inability to perform.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Because it seems like, yes, sure, he does like do the driving thing at the beginning, but he, it's more of a gesture.
Listen, man, it's literally emasculating.
Yeah.
Like it's like, and if you're already someone who has forfeited your rights as a husband and as a potential father, to have that also denied you, and then in some sense robbed from you by this other man is like just I imagine totally devastating. He's a married man. Yeah. Like this is not some sort of accidental aspect to his life or to his identity.
Right. Just a quick aside to the listeners. We had some sound issues with the next several minutes of our recording. So what we did, because we wanted to keep some of the things we talked about, is we went back using the transcript and re-recorded the next several minutes of material. And so that will explain any kind of difference in sound that you hear. And at a certain point, it'll just switch back to the main bulk of the recording. So there will be a couple of changes in the audio quality. So one of the things I'm trying to figure out is what is it that he's the most upset about? Why is he responding in this way, spying on her, etc.? Is it that he already knows that she's having an affair and he's just sort of punishing himself by observing it further? Or is he jealous that they can have sex and he can't? Or is it that he's actually trying to ascertain for certain that he's actually still not sure or in denial about what's going on?
Right.
We get this really striking scene where she's been hooking up with this younger man in her mom's apartment, which is unoccupied. And he goes and sits outside the apartment on the staircase where he's not visible and watches the guy coming out. And then after the guy leaves, he's about to go in and he's made a copy of the key. He's about to go in and he hears her coming out and he runs away almost like he was doing something wrong. Yeah. It's just very striking how he's avoiding any kind of confrontation, almost as though he is the one who's in the wrong here.
Right. Yeah. The most dreadful moment of the film, I thought, was that moment when he's hiding in the closet and she sees him through the crack in the closet and she's coming over. It's like something out of a horror movie. She's really angry with him. And it's also in the first person, so you feel like you're hiding in the closet with him, like some sort of horrific hide and seek.
Sure, yeah. So another of my questions is like, do you sympathize with this guy? I mean, how much do you have contempt for him? Because he does behave in a kind of a pathetic manner throughout the film, and that would tend to reduce your sympathy. Yeah.
Well, I guess aside from that specific moment in the closet, I don't sympathize with him a whole lot throughout the film. And I think that's because here we have a guy whose marriage is already pretty fundamentally broken, right? Like from the beginning, they told themselves, we're not having children. So they've missed what is the whole point of marriage primarily. And you get this intuition of that when at the beginning they say to each other, maybe if we had had a child, this would have been easier. And there's this acknowledgement, right? There's this sense of like, well, yeah, you reap what you sow. So I think that while you're watching this film, that's what's happening is what's happening is going to snap them out of it together.
Right.
Yeah, he's a cuckold, but he's not exactly like an innocent victim. They've together been the maker of their own undoing to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So, I mean, to speak to that, fundamental brokenness in their marriage. So once they've had this confrontation and he's come out of the closet, she says, "You were right," referring to the conversation that they had at the beginning of the film that we discussed earlier. She says, "Everything does have to be spelled out. I'm not going to keep things from you anymore so that you won't have to hide." And she also says, "You were right. We should have had children. Let's adopt." And there's this moment where it's the first moment where she's realizing that she might lose her marriage with him. You almost get the sense that she genuinely didn't think that he would be so hurt by what she was doing, especially given what he had said earlier about, oh, maybe you should take a lover. As crazy as that sounds. And so now she's really upset and she's trying to win him back. So she says, "Okay, let's adopt a child." It's really interesting that that's such a central aspect of what she sees to be the solution to the problem in the ending of the film.
Right.
We also get the sense that it's not that easy. Let's just adopt a child and our problems will be solved. I'm sure you've heard people say, it's a mistake that people make to think that having children will save their marriage.
Right.
But when the problem with your marriage is bound up with kind of a disintegration of the constitutive elements of marriage, then there's reason to believe that that does have something to do with it.
Right. Totally.
So, I mean, the problem is it's not like the problem is so much any sort of character flaw that they might have sort of in itself, but it's the choices that they made about what marriage is and what their marriage is going to look like.
Right. You don't get the sense in the film that this is because of some sort of fundamental incompatibility between the two of them.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it seems, despite all that, it does seem when you're watching, oh, that's too easy. And they decide to separate for a little bit to get some space, but they're still planning on adopting. And she's saying goodbye to him at the train station. And they're both in kind of a good mood. It's like, well, this seems weird that like, it can't be this easy, right?
Yeah.
And we did get indications that more needs to happen. I think she asks, do you trust me? And he just kind of smiles, but he doesn't say yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think there's something very real to this idea that like not having had children as being sort of a fundamental problem with their marriage. I think the writers of this film are hitting on something correct.
Right.
And it's also really interesting to me that the film begins with her saying that sex and love are separate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so people might think that sex and love can be separated in marriage, and that also that sex and love can be separated from children. There's two separations going on here. And so if sex and love can be separated from children, then that lends itself to this idea then, well, okay, then sex and love can be separated from one another. And therefore I can have an affair with someone to satisfy my own needs, and it won't really affect the love between me and my husband. So I think the film presents these delusions as being kind of all of a piece.
Definitely. And it's pretty amazing because there's just no way that we're capable of this level, like in popular media, of having this discussion at this level. I just read Casti Kanubi over on the Catholic Culture Audiobooks podcast that will have been released by the time this episode is out. And that's the encyclical letter by Pope Pius XI on marriage. And, this was written in 1930, but it's still super relevant. In fact, maybe more relevant now than it was even in 1930, because these are still the issues that we're grappling with in marriage and understanding the purpose of marriage and the purpose of sex. And, if our confusion has sort of, has progressed further, and we've gotten so far removed from these sort of fundamental understandings, the question becomes like, how do you draw people back to being able to discuss these questions at the level at which you can see them being discussed, even as short a time ago as this film. And I think that the pathway to that is sort of marked out in this film too. It's the insistence, like the stubborn insistence, that the reason for marriage is the procreation and education of children.
Hmm.
And I think that there's this intimation of that in this film behind everything else that's going on, is that this marriage between these two individuals is this failure to complete, this failure to recognize what their marriage is, right? I mean, Pope Pius is pretty clear in that encyclical that a marriage that's entered into that excludes the possibility of children from the get-go is no true marriage.
Hmm.
So the characters in this film, they don't have a true marriage in that sense, right? And this is the film is kind of like the progressive discovery of that. So
Yeah. You know what's funny? I'm thinking about when you say that, it makes me think of 8.5. You know, when will you truly marry me? That line.
Right. Exactly. And we talked about this issue a fair bit when in our discussion of that film, or sort of parallel issues about lust and its relationship to creativity, right? Or its sort of antithetical relationship to creativity. But you know, while it might seem at the end of this film that it's too simple a solution to say, okay, we'll adopt and everything will be better, I think that in that moment, as a viewer, we want to be like, yes, this is getting to the heart of the problem. This is really what's at the root.
Yeah, you know, another thing I was thinking about with this is that, you know, people always say that having children transforms you. And that doesn't mean it makes you a saint, and people can still be selfish and wicked, you know, having children. But that's a very common thing to hear, you know, that, oh, it adds new dimensions to your reality or changes your perspective. But people don't talk about just getting married changing you on the same level that they talk about having kids changing you.
Mm-hmm.
A sacramental marriage, of course, it'll do so more than a natural one, but basically you get married, you have an influence on each other, but it doesn't change your lifestyle and your basic orientation in life in the same way that having children does.
Sure. Yeah.
Or at least I think if so, I think you have to be much more intentional about it. I think having children who depend on you just sort of like of necessity,
right? Unless
you're like almost going out of your way to be neglectful,
totally,
you know,
totally
does change your lifestyle in a deeper way.
Yeah. Especially for women, I might add, is just that, especially, at least as what I've observed in my own marriage, is that like my wife, Karina, when she became a mother, it was like I don't want to say it was effortless or passive, but it was almost as if like she just became a mother, you know, it just changed her. And then all of a sudden it was like all these things inside of her were firing, you know, not just on the natural level, but seemingly on the spiritual level as well. Whereas I think that for fathers, while there certainly is like an element of that, that sort of just happens by virtue of like the presence of this new being, it's almost like there's like an extra effort that has to be made to reach for that and really change things in your life. Because at the end of the day, the baby doesn't depend on you as much as it depends on the mother in those early days, right?
Right. Not directly. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, it's like I'm not able to nurse this baby, but what am I able to do? And so I just think it's interesting that in this film, it comes by way of the wife, suggesting, yes, let's adopt, you know?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if you don't have children deliberately, then there's a real possibility of never maturing in the way that having children doesn't guarantee, but it does ask of you, you know? So you stay stuck. And even if you do stay together for decades, there's the probability that you're going to stay stuck at a certain level of personal development because you've never had that more brought forth from you by the demands of having children. And that leaves a lot of room and free time, even just on the most basic level, open for selfishness to manifest itself in various ways.
Definitely. Absolutely. And to be clear, you know, everybody's called to fatherhood or to motherhood, as the case may be, right? You know, so even in those marriages that have the cross of not being able to have children, you know, for example, the couple in this film, right? They can't have children, but that does not mean that the same imperatives are not
operating, right?
Right.
Like they have to have children. And if they can't have children, biologically, then they can adopt. Or if they're not going to adopt, they need to be fruitful and multiply in some sense, like in some way,
Yeah.
like, and he has to be a father and she has to be a mother,
Right.
or there is this stuntedness,
Yeah, they need to be like serving something other than like their status quo. In this case, we see what like serving that status quo and like keeping their marriage together means. Apparently means like going and selfishly seeking pleasure outside of marriage.
It means you'll have to take your lover,
Right.
if you haven't already.
Right.
And that's just that's the kind of knots that you get yourself bound up in when you thwart like the very definition of marriage, from the get-go.
Yeah.
So
the connection this film has with the Ninth Commandment is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so like, yes, this young man who I don't think we'll talk about too much because he's not like, that interesting or fleshed out of a character, but this young man is obviously coveting another man's wife. And it's interesting, like this separation of sex from love, because like he declares his love for her when she ends their affair, and she's like clearly was not thinking it was about that. And so like it was a lie just as much there as it was in the case of like, her husband.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's kind of like we're kind of dealing with like an inversion of the Ninth Commandment too, which is like, the husband not like, instead of like being about coveting someone else's wife, it's like the husband not like claiming his like sole possession of his wife, and not claiming the fidelity that's owed to him, which he like says explicitly at the end. It's like, he's like, yeah, I have no right to like make demands on you. And she's like, yes, you do.
Yeah.
So it's interesting too, how she becomes like, in some way, like the protagonist at the end of the film. Like, I think like almost at that moment when they had that confrontation, she becomes like the protagonist of the film, because she's the one who's now working to assert the reality of what their marriage is. When that crisis occurs, she's the one who like kind of immediately like sees how all the parts fit together.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that
to some extent, at the end of the film, he's still almost till the end of the film, he's still kind of stuck in his former mode of like watching and listening and reacting, and not like taking command. I mean, the fact that like he thinks she's going back to her lover at the end, even though she's not, like, he never thinks to say like, I demand that you stop this, or like anything like that. The response is, I don't know if you think that he wrote her a suicide note.
Yeah, I don't know.
Or if he just said he's leaving and then he ends up almost committing suicide.
Yeah, I don't know.
But, either way, his response is to give up.
Yeah.
Whereas she's the one who's fighting for their marriage.
Right.
At the end of the film.
It's interesting because we really do begin to identify with her really closely at the end. It's almost like it comes full circle, because at the beginning, as you mentioned, she is the first person we see. We see her waking up in the middle of the night, saying her husband's name. And so it's almost like from the beginning, it's framed to be her story. At the end, it really does feel like it becomes her story again, because when her ex-lover shows up at this ski resort where she's gone to get out of town and have some distance, he's basically like stalked her there, even though she's put an end to it.
In like a puppy dog way rather than like a creepy way.
Yeah. And she's
but like in a very frustrating way, because he's like, she immediately recognizes that like he's in like endangering everything.
Right. And she looks directly into the camera, which is very cool, because it's not, I really don't think it's like as simple as, oh, now it like implicates us in their story as viewers. I think that so often that's the tendency when reading these sorts of gestures of looking into the camera, like it somehow must now involve us because we're being looked at. But I don't think so. I think that in this instance, there's like this this really unsettling response in the viewer when you're looked at like that, you know? And it kind of, it's almost like, oh no, you know, like it's almost like this moment of like premonition, like this is bad.
Yeah.
And it happens a second time when she gets on the bus to Warsaw, and she's trying to get home as quickly as she can. But events are in the meanwhile unfolding back at home, with him writing his goodbye note and getting ready to go for his last bike ride. And we get another shot of her on the bus looking directly in the camera. And there's just like this weight to it, this premonition of a bad omen, you know?
Right.
So yeah, I love what happens in the end there. And then also with the timing in their communication, there's this like missed connection between the two of them, because you mentioned earlier how central phones are in this whole film, whether it's listening in on phone calls or getting a phone call from her lover, you know, that wasn't meant for you, and things like that. But at the end here, it's them not being able to reach one another.
Right.
She calls the apartment, and he purposefully chooses to not pick up.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that this is, you know, this is representative, I think, of the fact that it takes two to tango, you know, that in a marriage, it's very difficult, or in any sort of relationship, to just be like kind of like a one-way street, you know, and she cannot do this by herself. She even if she wants to love him, he has to choose to accept that, and vice versa. And so the sort of the final, you know, the final gesture of this film, with him in the hospital having survived this would-be suicide attempt, maybe paralyzed in some way, we don't know. I think that it's interesting that he progresses from impotency to maybe, you know, real paralysis. Okay. But he has a nurse hold the phone to his ear and dial for him. He calls the apartment where she has just discovered this goodbye note from him, having finally gotten back to Warsaw, and she picks up, you know? And so it's like, it's in this gesture of him dialing and asserting, you know, reaching out, and her accepting that there's like this completion,
right?
You know,
and she's like, "You're here." She's grateful for the fact that he's there. It's not like he's waiting for her to show up in his life,
right?
Yeah,
and the last words of the film are, "I'm here."
Yeah, and he smiled, and we do also get him smiling a little bit when he hears that she's not in the hotel at the ski resort,
right?
You know, So it's an interesting conclusion, and I like how deftly we've noticed Kieslowski is really deft in like switching the point of view in these episodes, like happened in number 6, between the peeping Tom and the woman, where like the second half of the story really becomes from her perspective,
right?
And I think something similar happens here, and it's done in a very deft way, like a very natural way.
Yeah, so before we wrap up, I think that probably the last thing worth touching on is this side story with the heart patient.
Yeah. So we already kind of laid out the concept of it.
Yeah.
There's a couple of interesting. So basically, she says her mother. My mother wants me to have everything, meaning to be a famous singer, because she has this talent as a classical singer. But me, I only want this much. She holds up her fingers in like a small way. And so like there's like a parallel there to his like unwillingness to sort of like claim anything more than just like a nominal marriage almost.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And his like timidity. And so then she comes to him, and they have this relationship of real honesty, where she comes to him for like an honest answer about what are her chances with the surgery, and you know, she ends up taking it. She ends up taking the option of the surgery, even though it wasn't necessary to save her life, for the sake of being able to have a singing career. And then we see them talking again towards the end, and she says, you know, I'm different now.
Yeah, she says, "I hate you."
Yeah.
He says, "Why? It was successful." And she
Right.
says, "Yes, but I know I'm different now."
Yeah. The fact is she now has this desire to sing
Yeah.
that she didn't, or that was suppressed before, which is interesting. So it kind of like, it dovetails with this like wanting more out of your marriage, like wanting a child, for example. And it takes like this crisis to bring them both to that point. It takes the crisis of the confrontation and then the crisis of his suicide attempt.
Yeah. I think that another interesting thing that this side character does is, to me, it suggests that there may be ways for him to carry on his own affair. Because here's this really young, really beautiful woman who is coming to him and having these like intimate conversations with him. She's telling him about music that she sings, and he's going out and buying the record and listening to it. And she's always wearing this sort of like patience, like robe.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask about. Is like, does this film sexualize her, or does it indicate that he's attracted to her?
I think a little bit,
because we get well, she's always wearing this robe. It's kind of a shortish robe. We get this like, I think it's their first conversation as she's walking down the hall. We get this like weirdly low angle shot where like it's not like as a character she's sexualized. It's more like the visual gestures of the filmmaking. You know, it's not like she's like acting seductive or anything like that. But like we get this low angle where like you're seeing like a lot more of her legs, albeit from like a distance. And then when she's singing for him a little bit, or like kind of humming for him, because they're talking about this composer, she's like doing these like kind of almost conducting gestures, and then like the camera pans down with her finger as she finishes and kind of like just like focuses on her like knee.
Yeah, she like grips. She grips like her knee a little bit.
It's not like her gesture is a sexual one.
No,
but it's just like the way the camera focuses, and it's not like super like, you know, it's not like super exaggerated or anything.
No,
but you just can't help but notice.
And it's a little suggestive.
It's a little suggestive. You're noticing. So is it like? Is it suggesting that this is like something that he's aware of? You know?
Yeah. Well, listen. All I'm saying is that it kind of creates that tension, that there is like the presence of this young, beautiful woman in his life, and you know, it might be a like a red herring, because of course it doesn't turn out to be an affair,
right?
But it kind of contributes to the overall sense of, well, you called this a nail biter, but like there is like a kind of, you know, you're on the edge of your seat throughout this, not really sure what direction things are going to head,
right?
You know, and I think that plenty of other films would have had it head in that direction, you know, with a character like this.
Were it not for some of these camera moves, I would have taken this side plot as more of like a what's the word? Like kind of like a relief from everything else that's going on, which is sort of how it functions emotionally, because we've got this like very light relationship, this very like honest relationship,
right,
and this character who is like a much more like pure character and who he's sort of able to relate to in that way. I like what you say. It doesn't necessarily go so far as to even suggest like what he's thinking so much as just like the possibility,
right?
Like that just simply like exists on like an objective level,
right. It's interesting that we don't return to this character again at the end of the film. The last we see of her is quite a ways out from the film's conclusion. But what does happen is that as the film cuts to black, we hear that aria again, you know, and so the film is continuing to operate after the credits roll, you know. I think that that's true of all film, but particularly in this instance, because it's the first time we're hearing this aria or whatever it is just sung clearly and fully. We hear it on the record, but then it's what's the word for music that's in the scene?
Diegetic.
Yeah. But this is just like full coming through your speakers.
Right.
You hear the music that's
Right.
kind of been alluded to throughout the film.
Right.
So that's significant, I think. And it's
Interesting,
sort
yeah.
of attendant with that is everything that we know about this story and about what's been done for this young woman and what she now can do, you know?
Interesting.
So I think that I think that even that side story comes back at the end in the credits, in that music that's playing.
Yeah. Also worth mentioning, the music in this episode is the main Decalogue theme music that we hear in the opening titles.
That's
for
right.
the little piano chords
That's
that we hear in
right.
the opening titles of every episode is the main theme for this
Wow.
episode.
Yeah, and it's really nice because it's that theme, you know, there's a lot of variations on that theme throughout.
Yeah.
You know, especially when he has that suicide attempt, there's like a really unsettling one. But yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And to be honest with you, I think that thematically, in the plot, in the story, there is something, you know, that's kind of, we talked about this a little bit with the last Decalogue, Decalogue 8, that the various strands are beginning to come together and be connected.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that with this final exchange, my God, you're there, I'm here. I think there is something kind of holistic about that, you know, that can be applied to all of the Decalogues, you know, that literally, my God, you're here, or God, you're here, you know.
Yeah.
That's what she says. God, you're here.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm here.
Yeah.
You know, I think that there's a little more to it than just what's going on between the two of them.
Right,
you know?
right.
Yeah.
This episode also has one of my favorite shots from the series.
Which
Can you
one is
guess?
that? Oh, can I guess?
Yeah. One of the more memorable shots, I think.
Is it when they're in the elevator?
Yes.
Yeah. And the lighting. Yeah.
The lighting is almost like spotlighting them differently.
Yeah.
They're kind of together but separate, and like, yeah, I think that's a cool,
That is very cool.
very cool shot.
Yeah.
This episode, like, you know, it has some of the same kind of like heavy-handed symbolism that some of the other ones do. It almost seems like each episode has like some symbols that are like really integral to the story and work really well, like the phones, and then a few other things that are just like the glove compartment falling open in this that are just like, okay.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
you know?
Right.
But yeah, overall an episode I thought one of the more enjoyable to watch.
Yeah, definitely.
One of the more like dramatically compelling. The way that it's timed is really like precise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I was going to choose just one Decalogue to show someone, this is one of the ones I would consider. You know, I don't know. I haven't
Interesting.
like prepared which like would be my
Okay.
top three.
Well,
but
we
this
should.
definitely-
Well, we should talk about that when we do our wrap up.
Yeah. Well, we've
for the
only got
series.
one more. We've only got one more Decalogue to go.
Yeah. So our next Decalogue, not the next episode of this podcast, but 2 or 3 episodes from now, we'll be discussing the final Decalogue episode, Decalogue 10, and it's a comedy. So it's going to be a different tone from the rest of them. It's a comedy about 2 sons fighting over their deceased father's stamp collection. Everybody, thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. If you'd like to help us keep our podcast network going, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio.
By the time this episode releases, we'll be in the middle of a big fall fundraising campaign. So it's a great time to donate because
Oh, nice.
anything you donate will be doubled, will be matched by certain of our key donors who have set up a challenge grant that we're trying to meet. So
great.
yeah, head over to catholicculture.org/donate/audio
Yeah.
and we'll earmark your donation specifically for this podcast.
Just a final note for the listeners. We've talked many times about how it's hard to see the Decalogue series without just getting it on DVD or Blu-ray. It's not really streaming in any of the normal places online. Right now, as this episode is released and for a couple weeks after, there's a great opportunity to buy the Blu-ray for half off because Barnes & Noble a couple times a year has a 50% off sale of all of its Criterion Collection DVDs and Blu-rays. So this is a great time if you wanted to get the Decalogue series to pick up that Criterion Blu-ray edition.
can take it.